Story 1. The Office Anomaly. I remember that night shift at the office like it was yesterday. It was one of those routine nights when the world outside had gone quiet, and the only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I was alone in that empty building, my tasks as mundane as they come. As the hours passed, the night took on a monotonous rhythm. I moved from my desk to the coffee machine and back again, doing my best to stay awake. And then, something peculiar happened. I was glancing at the security camera footage, and that's when I saw it. A flickering light in one of the conference rooms. It seemed as though someone had left a projector running. My curiosity piqued, and I headed over to investigate. When I reached the room, though, the light had gone, and the room was as vacant as it had been when I entered the building. I shook my head, attributing it to a glitch in the system, or my tired mind playing tricks on me. I went back to my desk, trying to focus on my work. But the strange events of that night weren't finished with me. Hours later, as I was lost in the dull glow of my computer screen, the flickering light reappeared on the security footage. This time, though, I was sure I heard faint voices coming from the room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I approached cautiously. I turned the doorknob, and as I pushed the door open, the voices stopped abruptly. The room was still empty, the projector casting a weird pattern on the wall. I reached for the light switch and turned off the projector. I called out, thinking maybe a colleague was playing a prank on me, but there was no response, just an eerie silence. I spent the rest of the night with that unshakable feeling of unease gnawing at me. The office was supposed to be deserted, and I couldn't explain what I had seen and heard. Morning eventually came, and I mentioned the strange incident to my coworkers, but they brushed it off as a figment of my imagination, a trick played on me by fatigue. To this day, I can't quite rationalize or forget the peculiar events of that night. It wasn't the stuff of horror movies or ghost stories, but it left me with a lingering sense of unease, an unsettling experience that defied explanation. Story 2. The Mysterious Factory. I've worked my fair share of night shifts over the years, and most of them were fairly routine, quiet, and uneventful. But there's one night that stands out, a night that I can't quite forget, no matter how hard I try. It was at this massive factory, one of those sprawling industrial places with towering machines and dimly lit corridors. My job was simple enough: monitor the machinery during the night shift, make sure everything was running smoothly, and ensure security. Seemed easy enough, at least until that one fateful night. I arrived at the factory, coffee in hand, and began my rounds. As the hours rolled by, everything seemed normal. The machines hummed along as they should, and there wasn't a soul in sight. It was business as usual until it wasn't. At around midnight, I noticed something strange. The machines, which should have been completely dormant at that hour, started to come to life on their own. Conveyor belts began to move, gears turned, and it was as if someone had activated them remotely. My first instinct was to think it was some kind of malfunction, a technical glitch, or perhaps even a prank from one of my colleagues. But as I looked around, I realized that I was entirely alone in that part of the factory. Now let me tell you, the sight of those machines moving independently was enough to send shivers down my spine. It wasn't a subtle thing either. It was like the factory itself had a mind of its own. I tried to shut down the machines, but they didn't respond to any of my commands. I couldn't make heads or tails of it, and fear started to creep in. The machines kept doing their strange thing for what seemed like a long time, but it was probably only a few minutes. The clanging and whirring noises echoed around the factory, making me feel more and more uneasy with each passing moment. I had no idea what was causing it or how to stop it. It was just bizarre and unsettling. But then, as suddenly as it had started, it all stopped. The machines went silent, and it felt like a switch had been flipped. The factory returned to its usual quiet self, with only the low buzz of the lights above. I was left standing there, trying to make sense of it all, but it seemed impossible. When I reported the incident to the mechanics and engineers, they were just as baffled as I was. They couldn't figure out how something like that could happen. They checked the logs and found that there was no record of the machine starting up that night. It was like the entire episode had never happened, and it left us all scratching our heads. As I left the factory that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I didn't have any answers, and it seemed like nobody did. The memory of that strange night continues to bother me, a reminder that sometimes things happen that just don't make any sense, no matter how hard you try to figure them out. Story 3. The Haunted Data Center. Working the night shift at that data center was something I'll never forget. It was a massive facility filled with rows upon rows of servers, all humming and whirring away in the darkness. My job was simple: ensure the data center's smooth operation during the night. Seemed like an uneventful gig, but that night was anything but ordinary. I had just settled into my routine, checking the servers, monitoring the systems, and keeping an eye on the countless status lights that blinked like distant stars in the dimly lit room. The silence was only broken by the soft hum of machinery. It was peaceful, in a way, but that peace didn't last long. As I was going about my tasks, I began to hear something strange, a faint, rhythmic tapping noise, like someone gently knocking on a door. It was coming from somewhere within the server racks, a sound that seemed out of place in the sterile environment of the data center. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, I was alone in the building, and there was no reason for anyone to be knocking on server racks. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more insistent. It was as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. With a sense of unease settling in, I checked the security cameras, scanning the empty aisles of servers. There was no sign of anyone else in the data center, just the machines and me. Curiosity and a creeping sense of dread drove me to follow the tapping sounds. They led me to a particular server rack, situated at the center of the room. The server's status lights flickered in an unusual pattern, almost like a code. It was unsettling, as if the data center itself was trying to communicate with me. I stared at those blinking lights, trying to decipher the message they held, but it remained an enigma. The tapping sounds continued, persistent and unrelenting. And then, unexpectedly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost deafening. I was left standing there, staring at the server rack, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. It was as though whatever had been trying to communicate had decided to cease its efforts. As the minutes ticked by, the data center remained silent and still. I cautiously resumed my duties, my mind racing with questions about what had just transpired. I reported the incident to my superiors, explaining in detail what had happened: the tapping, the unusual server lights, and the sudden silence. My coworkers were just as confused as I was, and the incident became a topic of discussion among us. We tried to make sense of it, but the truth remained elusive. The data center continued to operate normally in the following nights, with no recurrence of the strange phenomena. Story 4. The Midnight Lodgers. Let me tell you about one particular night during my time working the night shift at that quiet roadside motel. Most nights were calm. The motel was located in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by miles of darkness and silence. But this night was different, one that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. I sat behind the front desk, idly flipping through an outdated magazine. The hours seemed to crawl by, and I could hear the occasional distant rumble of a passing truck on the highway outside. Then, well past midnight, a rusty, beaten-up car pulled into the parking lot. The engine sputtered to a halt, and I watched as two figures emerged from the car. They were ominous, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of their hooded jackets. They approached the front desk, and I could barely make out their eyes gleaming with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about them, something not quite right. Without a word, they paid in cash and requested a room at the far end of the motel, far away from any prying eyes. I handed them the key, feeling a knot of unease in my stomach. As they walked away, their steps seemed to echo strangely in the quiet night. Hours passed, and I had almost forgotten about the strange pair when I was abruptly woken from my half-slumber by a series of unsettling sounds. It was like nothing I'd ever heard before, guttural, inhuman noises that seemed to twist and turn in the night air. Fear and curiosity gripped me as I approached their room. The sounds grew louder with each step, and my heart pounded in my chest. I reached their door but hesitated, my hand poised to knock. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the disturbing noises ceased. Silence fell over the motel once more. I returned to my desk, my mind filled with a mix of fear and confusion. What could have caused those strange, unsettling noises? Who were those two mysterious guests, and what were they up to in that room? Shortly after, the two figures emerged from their room, their faces still hidden beneath their hoods. Without saying a word, they handed me the key and departed, their presence feeling even more frightening than when they first arrived. After they disappeared into the night, I couldn't resist the urge to enter their room, expecting to discover some disturbing scene or evidence of unusual activities. However, to my surprise, everything appeared entirely ordinary. The beds were neatly made, and there was no sign of anything strange. As I locked the door and returned to the front desk, I questioned my own sanity. What had really transpired that night? The question still haunts me to this day. That's all for today, folks. Thank you all for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like, subscribe, and let me know down in the comments below which one of these was your favorite story. See you all very soon.